In this lab, we're going to learn about Microsoft Access and databases. This is actually Access Assignment 2. Access Assignment 1, we kind of got familiar with Microsoft Access, but now we're going to kind of dive in and get into a little bit more detail as to how Access works, but we're also going to demonstrate a lot of these concepts of databases that we learned about in class. So you'll see a lot of similarities here. Unlike the previous assignment, we're going to create our database from scratch this time instead of having a database given to us. But you'll notice there is a file on Blackboard. It's A02P1books.xslx. So go ahead and click on that, and you're going to download that file. And once it downloads, you can open it with Microsoft Excel. So I'm going to open up my copy here. And we're just going to look at it. We're just going to take a look at this file. We're not going to do anything with it here. I just want to show you what's in here. So the concept here is that this is a bookstore. So this is basically a bookstore that is using Microsoft Excel right now. So a lot of things we've learned about already in Microsoft Excel are probably being used in this spreadsheet. But sometimes it's difficult to do things with Microsoft Excel that are better done in a database. So for example, I have here a list of books and I also have a list of publishers. But how can I show both the publishers and the books together all in one place? It'd be difficult to do that with something like Microsoft Excel. You could do it with some fancy formulas and things like that, but a database is built for those types of relationships. So we're going to use a database instead. So we're going to start with this Excel spreadsheet, and we're going to import all of this into Microsoft Access. Now, the one tab that we're missing here is the authors. So we are going to create the authors in our Access database, just so we can see how to create a table from scratch in Microsoft Access. So let me go ahead and close this. And now I'm going to open Microsoft Access. So I'm going to open up Access. We're going to create a blank desktop database. So step number one, as soon as we open up Microsoft Access, we have basically a table. It automatically creates a table called Table 1. It has no columns in it and no data, but we're just going to go ahead and start adding some data. So field number 1, or the first thing is author number 11 is going to be an author with the last name Betchloss. Oh, I'm sorry, I have my caps lock on in the wrong direction. And then the first name is going to be Mike R. Then author number 12 in this case is going to be Turo. First name Scott. Author number 13 is going to be Rice. First name Ann. And so forth and so on. So just follow along here. You might want to pause the video once I get all these in. And I'm kind of shortening some of these names because I don't feel like typing them all out. And you can certainly feel free to do the same thing on your side. Oops, that should be author number 16, not 116. And that's going to be another Rice, this time Luann Rice. And then finally for author number 17, just put your name in. So author number 17 can be your name. So once you get all these in, you are going to close it. Now there's two X chiclets. There's one all the way up on the top in Access, but there's one, a smaller X further down just for this table. So we're going to hit the X that's just for this little table that we're creating. And when we do that, it's going to ask if we want to save the changes. You're going to say yes to save the changes, and we're going to call this authors because this is our authors table. Now notice when I double click on it, there's all my data, but there's a few things that are wrong here. We just kind of entered a bunch of data, but field 1, field 2, field 3, those are probably not very good names for our fields. And the data types in here are probably also not correct. And notice I've got two different fields with an integer in it for the ID number. I probably don't need those. So let's go ahead and close this again. I'm going to show you two different ways to open the table for design mode. One way is you can right click from here and click on design view. That's one way to get to the design view where we can change the schema for that table. The other way is just right click the table from the right hand side and you can click design view from there as well. So the first thing we want to do is get rid of this first column. So by the way, even though these are rows, these rows are basically showing us all the different columns for this table. So each one of these is a field in this table that we've created. But this is how we design that table. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the ID field that has the little key next to it. So I'm going to do that by right-clicking on that field. So once I highlight it, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to delete that row. And I just say yes to both of the warnings. So this first one, this is going to be an author ID. So field 1 is going to change to author ID. It's going to be a number, but make sure at the bottom where it says field size, it's set to long integer. So it should be a number, and it's a long integer. And if you recall, we talked about data types in class. So the data type for the author ID is going to be a number, because we know that that's a number. Field number 2 is going to be the last name. And really, just to make sure that it's not ambiguous, we're going to make it author last name. So I'm going to type author in front of that. There we go. So author last name. Short text is probably fine for the data type, but if you'll notice at the bottom it says that the field size is 255. That's awful long. I think it would be pretty unusual for an author last name to be 255 characters, so I'm going to shorten it to 20. Same thing with field number 3. So field number 3 is going to be author first name. And likewise, we're going to make that a field size of 20. Okay, so we've got our field sizes and all that. One thing I could also do here is I could add a description for these fields, and this is optional. You don't have to add a description, but for example, I could say authors. Oh wait, this is the last name. Sometimes you have cryptic field names, so it's nice to have a description. That way you can show that description in a view, for example, or in a saved query or something like that. So when you're outputting a report, you can see exactly what that column is. But these columns are pretty obviously named, so it's not important. Now, one last thing. If you recall from class, I talked about how every item in a database, everything that's in a database must have something that uniquely identifies it. This is a really important aspect of databases. For the author, the thing that's going to uniquely identify our authors is going to be the author ID, which was just the number that we put in. We just serialized the number, and that's called a surrogate key, meaning that it's something that identifies an author, but it's something we made up about the author. We couldn't use the last name and the first name because it's entirely possible that multiple authors could have the last name or the same first name. For example, we had Michael Rice and Luann Rice and Ann Rice. Both were authors. They both have the same last name. I can't use the first name because I've got two Michaels, for example. So we couldn't do that either. But the author ID is certainly going to be unique. So to tell the database that this is the unique field that I want to use, I'm going to right-click and set that as the primary key. So when I right-click on that, I can make it the primary key. And I now know that it's the primary key, but it puts a little icon, that little yellow key, next to the author ID. So once we do that, I can hit the little X on the right-hand side, not the one all the way on the top, just the smaller one over here. So I'm going to hit the X. It's going to ask if I want to save. I say yes. It's warning me that by saving this, I might be losing some of my data. And the reason it tells you that is if, let's say, we had an author with a name that was longer than 20 characters, that record would be lost when we make the save because we made that column too short. But that's not going to happen here because we know that none of our authors have a name that's too long or anything like that. So we know we're okay. So now if I double-click on authors, looks pretty good now. I've got my list of authors. They have an author ID and so forth and so on. So now my next step, and by the way, I just closed the table. So the next step is I want to import the data from that Excel spreadsheet. So I'm going to click on External Data, the External Data tab. I'm importing from Excel, so I'm going to click on Excel. It's going to ask me where my spreadsheet is. I downloaded it to my Downloads folder. In your computer, this may be a different folder name, but for me, I downloaded it and I put it in Downloads, which is the default location. In all likelihood, yours is probably also in the Downloads folder unless you've changed that setting in Microsoft Internet Explorer or Chrome or whichever browser you're using. So I'm going to click on Open. It might take a second for this to open, but you'll know when it works. It'll show you the correct file name on the top. So you can see mine has now switched to the correct file name. You're going to leave the radio button set to import the source data into a new table in the current database, and then click OK. So we're going to import two of the worksheets. One worksheet was for books, the other worksheet is publishers. So we're going to start with books, then we'll come back through and we'll do publishers. So starting with books, I'm going to click next. I'm going to leave this checkbox that says first row contains column headings. And you can see here that that makes sense. The first row is indeed the column headings. If I uncheck that, it assumes that their first row is actually data, which wouldn't make much sense because then my first row of data is going to be author code and title and so forth, like so. So you are going to check that to make sure that it's that you have your column names at the top. Then we're going to click on next. You do not need to make changes here. You could make changes here, so we could set these data types here rather than doing it later. But we're going to do that later on. So we'll go in and clean up these tables after we create them. It's just a little bit easier. So you're going to hit next. All right, in this screen, we're going to set the primary key. Now here we're importing books. So what uniquely identifies a book in this case is going to be the ISBN. As most of you know, ISBNs are what uniquely identifies books. So we don't have to make up our own identifier for books. It's already done for us with the ISBN. So you're going to click on that column. And you can see it changes it up here. You could also just click the drop down up here and choose ISBN. Then I'm going to click next. We're going to call this new table books. Makes sense. It's a good name for it. And then I'm going to click on finish. Oh, we do not need to save the import steps, by the way. All right, now we have our books table. We're going to go through the same process and do this for the authors table. So again, you're going to click on Excel. I'm going to find that same spreadsheet. Mine takes a second to update, so I'm waiting for it to open the file. All right, so now I've got the file here in the file name. I'm going to leave that radio button set to import source data into a new table. Click OK. I'm going to do publishers this time. Click next. The first row contains column headings. I'm going to make sure that's checked. I don't need to make any changes here. Here I am going to use a primary key. This time the primary key is going to be the pub ID, which you can see is right here. Note that the pub ID is just 2 letters. We're going to use that later on when we clean up this table a little bit. I'm going to click on finish. And now I have my publishers table. So let's go ahead and clean these up a little bit. So I'm going to right click on books and go to design view. So first, author code, I'm going to change to author ID instead, because that's what I called it in the authors table. Also, if you recall, when we created the authors table, which is the first one we created, it was a number for the data type for that field, but we didn't use double as, we didn't use double as the length. We used a long integer. So we're going to change this from double to long integer at the bottom for the length. All right, so for the title for the book, 255 is probably a bit excessive. Let's set that to 50. The ISBN can probably be just 13, because we know that ISBNs are typically 13 characters. All right, the publisher ID, that is short text. It's 2 letters, but it's only 2 letters. So we can change the field size to just 2, not 255. This is important to make sure you change this. We're going to use this later on. So be sure you do change the publisher ID's field size to 2, but you can leave it set to a short date. Now the publisher date should probably be a date field, not a number. I don't know what's going to happen if we change that to a date field, but we can give it a try. So we'll make that a date time. The price is currency. That makes sense. Stock amount is a number. That makes sense. We'll keep that the way it is. All right, so we made some changes for the books table. We're going to hit the little X up here to close it. It's going to ask if we want to save it. Of course, we say yes. And just as a sanity check, I'm going to double click on books and see what my data looks like. And it looks good. Notice that the publisher date is now actually a date. So that kind of worked, except the dates are all wrong. So whatever date they were in before, whatever format, Microsoft Access apparently didn't really understand it. But that's okay. That's not going to harm us with creating this little fake database here. But now we have to clean up the publishers table. So we're going to right click on publisher and go to design view. So the pub ID, if you recall, the pub ID is only 2 characters, not 255. So we're going to change that to 2 characters for the field size at the bottom. The publisher's name, I'm going to change that to 50 characters because I think 255 is a little excessive. Same thing with the address. You could probably just change that to 50. The publisher's city, we could probably make that about 30 characters, not 255. That'd be an awful long city name, 255 characters. And the state is just the 2-letter state code, so I can make that 2. A couple other changes I want to make here. The publisher address should be just pub address, and pub zip should just be pub zip without the space. So I took the space out of pub address and pub zip. All right. So that's all I need to change here. I could make that publisher ID. I guess I could do that. I'll change it to publisher ID just to keep the same format that we've been using for everything else. Okay, so we made those changes. I'm going to close that table using the little X on the right-hand side, not the one on the top. It's going to ask me if I want to save the changes. I say yes. It's warning me I could lose data. I understand. I'm going to hit yes anyway. All right, and if I just do a sanity check and double click on publishers, you can see I still have all my publishers. They're all there. It looks good. So now, the next thing we need to do, we've got 3 tables, but Microsoft Access has no idea how these tables are related to one another. And that's going to be helpful to build a relationship between these tables so that we can show information across the different tables in a report or a view or some kind of a query. So we're going to go to Database Tools. So the Database Tools tab, click in the Relationships group. We're going to click on the Relationships button. It's going to show us our 3 tables in a little dialog box. You can either double click each table, or when you click on a table, you can click Add. It'll work either way. But either way, we want to get all 3 tables on this little pane here where we can work with the relationships. Once you get your tables added, you're going to close that dialog box. So we know that books have publishers, and books also have authors. So how do they connect? So what I'm going to do is for books, I'm going to click and drag the author ID from books onto the author ID in authors. And then this is going to ask me how those two are related. It's author ID. So the author ID field is the same in both tables. And I'm going to select enforce referential integrity, which will make sure that I never have an author that doesn't have a book. And likewise, books always have an author that exists. So I'm going to click on create. And now I've got my relationship. So a book can have an author can have many books, and a book can have one author. I'm going to do the same thing with the publisher. So I'm going to click Publisher ID, drag it over to Publisher ID from the Publishers table. I'm going to enforce referential integrity. Notice that I've got the correct columns here. So in the Publishers table, it was called Publisher ID. In the Books table, we called it Pub ID. So the columns do not have to have the same name. I just have to indicate which is which. Then I'm going to create that relationship. And there's my relationship line. So my book can have one publisher, and my publisher can have many books. Once we're done with that, we're going to click the Close button and say yes to save it. So now we've saved our relationship. Now comes the interesting part. I can create a new query. So I'm going to click on the Create button at the top. The Create tab at the top. Then I'm going to do Query Wizard. And we're going to do a simple query. All right, now here's where it gets fun. So I'm going to choose, instead of having, in Microsoft Excel, I could only have, one tab for, one worksheet for each of these different types of things. But here, I can combine that information any way I like because the relationships exist. So let's say I wanted a report that shows me just the title and the date that the book was published. So I'm going to choose published date. So now I've got the title and published date. Then I want to also show who wrote the book. So I'm going to select authors and add the author's last name and first name. And then finally, I want to know who the publisher is. So I'm just going to add the publisher's name. So now I have a nice short report that's going to show me the title of the book, when it was published, who the author was, and the name of the publisher. And again, it's all connected through these relationships. So I'm just going to click on Finish, and there it is. So now I have one table that shows that information. So I'm going to save this. So I'm going to hit the little X chiclet here. I have Books Query over here. I can rename it, so you can go in here and rename if you like, but Books Query is just fine. And when I double click on it, it shows me my books with the author date and so forth. So once you're done, once you get to this step, you can save this spread or this sheet. To turn this into Blackboard, however, rather than turning in the Access database, instead I'm going to ask you to do a screenshot. So the way you do that in Microsoft Office, there's a cool utility called the screen snipping tool. So I'm just going to type snip into my search in the start menu, and one of the options is going to be the snipping tool. So if you type snip, you'll see the snipping tool. Once you open that up, you get this little dialog box with the snipping tool, and you can click on New, and then you simply draw a box around what you want to capture, and it creates an image. And then to save it, I just click on Save Snip. So I'm going to call this Access Assignment 2. And I'm going to save it, but I'm going to save this in my downloads just so I remember where it is. So I'm going to put it in downloads since that's where the access or everything that I download for the class is. So I'm just going to put it in downloads so I know where to find it. So now I've saved that image. So that's now an image that I can upload. If you're not sure what that image looks like and you just want to verify that it looks right, go into your Downloads folder in Windows. So you just click on File Explorer, go into the Downloads folder, and if you double click on that JPEG that you created, there it is. So there's my screenshot, and it looks correct. So I'm going to upload that into Blackboard. So I'm going to minimize access, go into Blackboard to the assignment, and just like any other assignment, click on Browse My Computer, and I can just click on that Access Assignment JPEG that I created, and I can turn it in. And that's it. Once you get to that step, you've completed this assignment.